Welcome, everybody. So those of you who are already here have gotten a little bit of a sneak peek at maybe what we're going to be talking about. I'll just give it maybe one more minute because I'm seeing a pretty steady trickle of people showing up. But thank you very much, whoever put that in the chat. I swear
Bloopers,
I've done this
bloopers.
before. Yeah, blooper reel, and it's being recorded. Maybe we'll leave the blooper reel in. Uh, okay. And let's get started. Holy smokes, there are 90 people attending. I'm blown away. As of starting this webinar, there are 254 people registered, and yeah, all that to say that I'm blown away and super excited to welcome you guys to MarshWatch. This is the first webinar in the series, and I like to call this one the Wonder of Wetlands. Thank you very much, Paul, for sending that note in. Okay, with all of that, let's get started. I am tuning in today, or broadcasting today, I guess, from Saskatoon. Before we get started, I'd just like to say that, Saskatoon is located on Treaty 6 territory, which encompasses the traditional lands of the Cree, Dakota, Nakota, Saulteaux, Stoney First Nations, and is the homeland of the Métis people. So welcome, everybody. And I've actually got a surprise special guest. I'd like to introduce Patrick Nadeau. He's the president of the company, and he's also interested in learning more about marsh birds. So I'll just hand it off to Patrick for a second because he'd like to welcome you guys to the show. Take it away, Patrick.
Awesome. Awesome. Thanks so much, Leanne. Hi, everybody. So, as Leanne was saying, my name is Patrick Nadeau. I'm the president and CEO of Birds Canada, and I'm wearing two hats this evening. The first one was wearing my president and CEO hat. I thought I'd come in and say thank you so much for your interest in this program. I mean, we're overjoyed in the interest. MarshWatch is something that I really believe in, and it's an awesome stepping stone. It's an awesome, I would call it, sort of non-threatening way to learn way more about wetland birds. So super excited to have you join us. Thank you so much. And the other hat I'm wearing is I'm here to learn right alongside you. A few weeks ago, I was telling Leanne and some colleagues, I thought, you know what, 2024 for me is the year of the marsh birds. I'd like to think I'm a decent birder, but the marsh birds, there's some toughies in there. And I know Leanne is an awesome coach and teacher. And so I thought, hey, why don't I sit in alongside all of you great people? And so wearing both hats, but welcome, and I look forward to learning a lot more. I will not, however, disclose my quiz results at the end, and so you'll just have to you'll just have to believe me that I've learned a thing or two. All right, back over to you, Leanne, and happy learning, everyone.
Awesome. I'll just make you not a co-host anymore so you can disappear and fade into the background.
Thanks.
Hopefully that worked. I can still see that your little block is there, but your camera's off and you're muted. Awesome. Okay. So with that, just a short little agenda for this evening. I'm going to tell you, a little bit more about what Marsh Watch is, presuming everybody's heard a little bit about it, but I'll just go over some details. Then I'm going to just explain to you why I think, and why some other people think too, why wetlands are amazing, wonderful places. I'll share my contact info at the end of it. And then I'm going to hit the unrecord button or the stop recording button, and you can discuss. Unfortunately, this is a webinar format, so you can't unmute yourselves. But as you have all discovered, we can now chat in the chat bar. So you can, discuss amongst yourselves, raise questions. Because this is recorded, I'm gonna keep questions till the end. I think that'll work better because when people view this online later, they don't have to sit through me awkwardly answering some questions. So I'll answer questions at the end, but feel free to type them in as you go, and maybe type them in like 3 times if I'm doing something wrong or something's not working, as you guys already have. Thank you. Okay. And afterwards, I'm going to set this up for every webinar. It's just going to ask you how many people are viewing with you and, which province you're from or territory. There's a button for those in the US. I did see someone tuning in from Oregon on there. So this just helps us know, like, are we reaching, like, who are we reaching? Are we reaching the people that, we're targeting, which is mostly folks on the prairies, but, you know, this is a webinar for everyone. So with that, I'll just give you a little bit of information about myself. My name's Leanne Latrimoy, and I do work for Birds Canada. We're a not for profit organization, if you're not familiar with us, and our mission is to drive action to increase the understanding, appreciation, and conservation of birds in Canada, including their wild habitats. And hopefully, through series like this, we're knocking off those first two, the understanding and the appreciation, because wetlands are super cool places. And as you might see by this collection of photos of me through time, that I really, really love wetlands. I started doing bird surveys in 2008. Um, Near Long Point, Ontario. And, I absolutely fell in love with wetlands. They're such an incredible place to immerse yourself in. And what's neat about them as well from a learning perspective, because this is how I learned my birds, is that it's kind of a defined suite of species. You're not trying to learn all of the birds in the world. You're not worried about the stuff in the forest or the grasslands. You're just like, nope, the suite of marsh birds. So I think wetlands are a really great conduit for, picking a habitat type and trying to learn what's in that habitat type. And then you can take those lessons and extrapolate them out. So I truly love wetlands. I came to Saskatchewan in 2012 to survey marsh birds here, and I haven't really left. So I absolutely love it here. And as you'll see throughout this presentation, the prairies are just blessed with an incredible amount and diversity of wetlands. So let's get started. What on earth is MarshWatch anyway? It's, as Patrick alluded to, it's an introductory program. It's a slow drip. I'm not going to throw, 50 bird species at you a week and expect that you're going to retain anything. It's going to be slow. So we're going to cover birds and amphibians by sight and sound, and a little bit of wetland appreciation. There's going to be 10 weekly webinars, but they're all going to be recorded and posted online because life happens. Most of the time it's hard to schedule something to do 10 weeks in a row. So if you have to miss a few, don't worry. They're going to be recorded, posted online on the MarshWatch webpage, a day or two later. So, you can always go back and review them at any time, or if you missed, you can go and take those in. There's going to be quizzes, and these are low pressure quizzes. I don't want you to think of this as like an exam. The quiz is more of a learning tool, and we'll have some at the end of each webinar. We don't have one today, but we will during the ID sessions. And those are mostly going to be visual and a little bit of, describing what a bird sounds like and doing some matching games. And I also have a suite of online quizzes that you can do. And use your book, use any notes that you've taken. This is how I in the past have learned a lot. I've set different programs up to quiz me on birds, and you do it with your guide next to you. This isn't an exam, this is a learning journey. And so if you see the bird picture, go look it up in your guide, and that helps you. That's what you're going to be doing in real life. So there will be quizzes, but they will be no pressure quizzes. You don't have to do them if you don't want to. What's also cool is I'm going to be doing some guided walks in select locations in Saskatchewan and Manitoba. For sure going to be doing some in Saskatoon because that's where I live, and Regina is close by. I'll probably do some in Brandon. Last year we did one in Minnedosa, so we're going to be planning a little bit more. And later on in the series, I'll be letting you know. But if you have a request, if you want to see, I have this really cool wetland. I think other people might like to come visit it. Let me know. I am open to going places. Obviously, within the prairie region. I can't go all the way back to Montreal or anything. Um, and the goal of this project, hopefully, I can give you the confidence to get out to a wetland and submit your first checklist from, a wetland of your choosing anywhere in June or July. And, doing that sort of thing helps contribute information to our greater knowledge base of, birds and distribution. So that's what MarshWatch is in a nutshell. We're going to be doing a bunch of ID sessions. And in late May, we'll have one great big review session. It's going to be a little bit longer. Most of our sessions are going to last for about an hour. The review session last year went on for a little longer. So I just wanted to say, we have we're going to be expecting a bigger one May 22nd because it's going to review a lot of things. And then the last one is going to be telling you about how you can collect data for the program and a little bit of a wrap up, how many people attended, where from, all that kind of good stuff. And we'll also do, I think, a little bit of listening to soundscapes so you can, put some of your skills to use. The ID sessions, we're going to cover about 6 to 8 species, ID by sight, sound, habitat preferences, where you're going to find them, some cool facts about some of the species, as well as, 1 to 2 amphibians as well by sight and sound. Then there's going to be a review quiz, and then we'll have discussion. So that's what the ID sessions are going to be like. I know this is a great big list, but don't worry, we're going to go at them slow. If you're in an area where the marsh monitoring program exists, I've just highlighted the focal species that you're going to need to know for that program. So we're going to be covering, all of those species. This program does act as a stepping stone to the marsh monitoring program. We've been hoping to get it back on the prairies. We're not quite on track to do that yet, but I hope to bring the marsh monitoring program back to the prairies at some point. And building a base of people who are, passionate about marshes and know some of their birds is a great place to start. So this is the idea behind this program. And we're going to have a cancellation plan. I do get migraines and I can't control that. So I'm going to have a cancellation plan set out. If I have to cancel for any reason, I'm going to send out an email as soon as I possibly can. And we'll just have a standing recancellation date. It'll be the following Friday at 7 p.m. And again, if you can't attend that, don't worry, we'll be recording it. There will be a reminder 1 hour before the webinar. And again, I'll send out an email as soon as possible letting you know that the webinar is canceled. But always good to have a cancellation plan on deck. And here's just a little bit of a preview of the sort of thing that you're going to see in the ID webinars. I'm not going to go through the green wing teal in detail, but this does kind of highlight, we've got some great pictures, pointers for how to identify a species, and this one in particular for the green wing teal, this little cream patch here. I don't know how it took me probably 10 years to realize that that was the key for this female duck, but it's one of the keys. And so I love sharing those sorts of little ID features for you. Cover a little bit of diet. We also play some sounds. So here's the call of the green-winged teal. Cute little peeping noise. And we do lots of comparisons along the way because it's well and good to learn each one in isolation, but the trick is when you're out there trying to identify a bird, you're trying to differentiate it from the other one next to it, perhaps. So we'll be doing lots of comparisons like this. So comparing these two small teal hens, the blue-winged teal and the green-winged teal. Just want to note that usually, as much as possible, I try to highlight local photographers. And when I don't have enough materials, I often source it from iNaturalist because when you're submitting stuff to iNaturalist, you opt into various copyrights. So, you can set it to have no copyright, for you can have it, not for profit use only with credit or with credit. So, there's lots of different options. So I just wanted to say that's where I source my photos, primarily local photographers as much as I can, but I also source from iNaturalist under those Creative Commons licenses. Okay, next up, let's get into the wonder of wetlands and parts of why I think that they're so incredible and so very neat. So I would like you to hop in my imaginary kayak. We'll pretend it's a nice big kayak. And you can see from the ripples on the water that there's a little bit of a breeze. So the mosquitoes are not going to be a problem for us today. This is a quite large, quite lovely wetland. And so as we paddle around in our imaginary wetland, we're going to be thinking about, you know, what kinds of critters here are that we're hearing, what lives here, why are these wetlands important? And so, with that in mind, I just want to play you this soundscape from one of my favorite areas, I think, in the whole world. There's this great big marshland complex out near Foam Lake, Saskatchewan. And here is a recording from 4 o'clock in the morning. I'm just going to play this. I think it's up. Here we go. So it is quite the hopping, active place. And if this all sounds just like a blur of bird noise to you, don't worry. We're gonna, as we go through this series, you're gonna learn, what a lot of those sounds are. In fact, you're gonna learn what all of those sounds are. But in case you didn't know, we had at least six sora, three marsh wrens, one sedge wren, at least four red-winged blackbirds calling, a yellow-headed blackbird, a Wilson snipe, American coot, and two American bitterns. And I'm seeing somebody is already writing in the comments that they got a bunch of those species. So awesome. It is quite the vibrant place. And these are, birds typical of this deep marshland complex. So what is this place we're in? What is a wetland? Well, the definition of a wetland is land that is saturated with long enough is land that is saturated with water long enough to promote wetland or aquatic processes as indicated by poorly drained soils, vegetation, and other biological activity that is adapted to the wet environment. A little bit more layman's terms, it's a dynamic transition habitat between water and dry land. And I emphasize dynamic here because, especially in the prairie system, we go through these kind of cyclical times of wetness and dryness. Those of you who are tuning in from the prairies know that we are definitely in the dry period. It has been quite droughty over much of the prairies for the last several years, but these wetlands, it's not quite a lake. It's not dry land. It's that soggy stuff. It's kind of mucky. If you were to walk in it, you would definitely want to be wearing rubber boots, maybe hip waders or even chest waders in some places. And, it's just pretty waterlogged. So they got these poorly drained soils, and all of these plants and animals are really, adapted for life in this kind of semi-aquatic environment. On the prairies, wetlands are classified based on water permanence and vegetation zones. So, as I alluded to, because it's such a dynamic place, the water levels are not consistent between years necessarily or even throughout the season. And back in 1971, Stewart and Cantrud came up with this classification of natural ponds and lakes in the glaciated prairie region. And that is where we are here in the prairie pothole region. So, this lovely drawing came from the Agro-Manitoba Wetland Classification Guide that Ducks Unlimited, oh my, Ducks Unlimited put out in 2019, and it just gives you an idea of the side profile of a typical, deep water wetland. And these wetlands are classified based on the deepest zone that is present in a wetland. And you don't need to study this or anything. It's more just to get across that some of these areas, hold water for an ephemeral amount of time. Some of them it's temporary, some it's seasonal, so they'll draw down as the season progresses. Some of them are semi-permanent, meaning that, 4 out of every 5 years they'll have water in them, and the deeper ones are usually wet, 9 out of 10. We're in the pretty dry cycle right now, and so we've been experiencing, dry wetland basins, even in the open water zones in some of them. But all of that is part of this natural process. And you can imagine that water level, if it were to, lower for a while and stay stable at that lower level, all of those plants would kind of march forward into what was previously open water because all of those plants are adapted to specific amounts of water. They don't, some of them like to have their feet wet, some of them like to have their feet maybe a little damp. So these vegetation zones can change and move over time as, water is either staying on the landscape for an extended period of time or if it's dry for an extended period of time. They're really neat dynamic places. Here's just an example of a wet meadow. All of this darker area is rushes. This is like a classic example of a class 2 wetland. It's a nice wet meadow versus something that you might think more of a classic wetland. Ooh, it's got some open water, some deep areas, some big stands of cattail and bulrushes. And this is a pretty good example, I think, of a wetland in flux. This was a recently flooded basin. It's going to be mostly dry in the summer, but a lot of these cattail stands, especially on this left-hand side here, there's not a lot of dead cattails, and that tells me that it's more of a recent colonization. So this has been wetter than it has in the past, and the cattails are kind of creeping in to where most of these sedges were before. But even the big basins can draw down a fair amount. And if this stays like this, you can imagine those cattail stands in the distance, those are going to die out and they're going to be replaced by more, dry land, wetland species, like the ones that like their feet just a little bit moist. And this basin is likely going to flood again at some point and become full, and it's going to flood out that vegetation that doesn't really like to be super soggy, and that's all going to build this organic peat layer at the bottom of the wetland. If you've ever gone through a wetland and felt all that mucky stuff, some of it's a bit sludgy, but there's also a lot of plant matter in there, and that's part of what makes a wetland special that we'll talk about in a second. But if you've ever played around on Google Earth, I like to do this because I like looking at landscape features and maps. But if you take a look at this, 2002, this was a pretty dry time on the prairies. But if you fast forward 10 years, you can see all of those little basins are full again because, as some of you might remember, in 2010, there was a lot of flooding on the prairies. And so I'll just toggle back and forth because this really highlights just how dynamic a landscape this is. If you just pick a wetland here, and I'll go back to the 2002, and a lot of those basins aren't there anymore, or you can see the basin is there, but it's dry, and a lot of times it's been cultivated. But then you get a few years of wetness, and those wetland vegetation suddenly spring back. There's large ponds again. So it's an incredibly dynamic landscape. And if you zoom out, even more, you might see like, wow, there is an awful lot of wetlands on the prairies. If you've ever, flown low enough in the daytime over, southern Manitoba, southern Saskatchewan, and southwestern or southeastern Alberta, you're going to see a lot of these small, kind of disconnected wetlands. And if you've ever thought, gosh, like, why? How does this happen? There's no streams connecting most of these. They're all kind of isolated. Well, it all had to do with the last ice age. And more specifically, the sequel. What came after the ice age? It was the meltdown. And if you can imagine, all of these glaciers, were covering this area during the last ice age. And, when an ice sheet retreats, it's not a orderly thing. It's not like there's one defined edge and it all melts in a nice orderly fashion, the front edge first and then goes back. It's messy. It breaks apart. And what happened on the prairies is that these chunks of ice, like our friends are standing on, got left. And, some of them would have been floating. It would have been a sea at one time. And, you know, as the waters drained, some of these ice chunks were there still. They lasted a long time. So sediment got poured in around them because you can imagine those glaciers are grinding all kinds of bedrocks. There was all kinds of sediment that got moved around. And what you wind up with is this incredible knob and kettle topography that is, a classic feature across this wide stretch of an area, and that has all of these little disconnected little basins. So just think about it like an ice cube. If you were to, have an ice cube in a tray of, wet dirt, and it was going to melt, it's going to leave a bit of a depression. So the same thing happened here, but on a massive scale. And I do mean massive. This is the prairie pothole region. It extends down into Iowa, across parts of South and North Dakota and Minnesota. Much of southern Manitoba that's outside of the forest is in this prairie pothole region. It covers a huge swath of Saskatchewan, a little bit into northern Montana, and as well in eastern Alberta. So it's quite a large region. And a region this large with all of these little basins mixed in with a lot of grassland area is really, really critical place for North American ducks. There are millions of these tiny wetlands in the pothole region, and it is, the most important breeding grounds for North American waterfowl for several species of duck. A lot of the geese go further north, but for the duck species, most of them, a lot of the breeding happens in this area. So it is a really critical area for breeding waterfowl. Oh, you might wonder, well, I mean, maybe beyond ducks, like are wetlands important? What do they do? It seems like a lot to maybe drive a tractor around. So what good are they for anyway? Well, let me tell you, they do a whole lot. Wetlands are neat because they act as a sponge, and in doing that, they both are capable of absorbing flood water, they're capable of recharging the groundwater, they sequester carbon, and they help to purify water. And so I want you to think, you've got some of these cattails. Those are those long, kind of grass-like looking plants that have like this chunk of brown on a stick. That's the flower on it. And, as that vegetation senesces for the year, some of it will fall into the water, it'll get smooshed down. And it's an anaerobic environment for the most part down there. So, forbidden corn dogs, yes. And all of that vegetation gets compounded year after year, and there's a lot of turnover. So what happens is that that vegetation degrades really, really slowly, and a lot of it sticks around for many, many, many years. I'm talking, I've seen, wetlands that had been cultivated for 30, 40 years. And if you dig down, you can see that sometime in the last few hundred years, it was at one point a wetland, but that was buried under lots of other sediment layers. And a lot of that organic material stays in the ground for a long time. So it sequesters a lot of carbon. It also really does act like a sponge. So, as you know, if you were to stick a dry sponge in a bucket of water, that sponge is going to swell up and it's going to absorb a lot of the flood water. But what happens if you leave a wet sponge on some paper towels, say? Well, that water is then going to leach out. And this is what wetlands do. They really do act as that sponge. So they're really, really helpful for absorbing floodwater, recharging groundwater. They sequester carbon a whole heck of a lot while they do it. And they also help to purify water as well. All of the vegetation that helps to prevent shoreline erosion. So wave action can be, really detrimental for shorelines. But if you have wetland plants, it helps reduce the size of those waves and it helps, keep your shoreline more intact. They're also, food and essential habitat for a wide range of animals from, fish, shellfish, water birds, land birds, mammals. There's lots of different creatures that rely heavily on wetlands. And they're also, important food and resources for humans. Wild rice is grown in wetland habitats. Cranberries, especially if you've been to the boreal forest and you get those little wild cranberries, they grow in muskeg. They're important nurseries for fish. We, can hunt waterfowl in them. You can forage for plant roots. That's, can be very important for some First Nations groups. So they're important resources and they do have a lot of ecosystem functions. Here's an example of a man-made recreation of a wetland system that is actually being used to do the bulk of the purification for um, the water produced for drinking in Walnut Cove. I'm not going to go through this, but the idea is that it goes through certain stages of aeration. There's bacteria in some of those ponds, and then the water moves slowly, filtering out some of the sediment, and then it moves through, a bunch of like little mazes of cattails, and those help to filter out some other pollutants. So, you know, we can mimic nature and use some of these systems, and we do in some places to help filter water for human consumption. It definitely goes through some additional purification steps just to make sure, but the bulk of what's done is done in this kind of man-made wetland process. So pretty interesting little thing. And probably what most of you are here for is, the interesting habitat it provides for wildlife. And wetlands are really critical nesting habitat for so many species of birds. Here's just a smattering of examples of species that really actually rely heavily for wetlands as their nesting grounds. Without wetlands, they wouldn't be in the area. So there's all kinds of species that rely on wetlands. And even the ones that don't nest in the wetlands, like many duck species, a lot of the dabbling ducks, we'll learn about those next week. A lot of dabbling ducks, they nest quite a ways away from a wetland. And once their little kids hatch, they're precocial, meaning that, they hatch out of the egg, and in a couple of hours they're pretty ready to get going, and mom will walk them along to a wetland, and it is critical brooding habitat for ducklings. They need this safe little space that's an area to feed and hide in. It's incredibly critical. And the interesting thing about all of those shallow little interconnected basins that we talked about is, well, they're shallow. They'll freeze solid in the winter, meaning that most of them, they can't really support anything fish wise. And this is great news for, lots of other critters because there's no competition for all of the little things that grow in these wetlands. I took this picture in and around Foam Lake, and these kind of little teeny tiny shrimp. I think they're either Gammarus or Hyalella. I wasn't sure. It's been a while, but in some of these fishless wetlands, they can be super super prolific for invertebrates, making absolutely fantastic food factories. And I was able to just scoop them up by the handful. They're basically little shrimpy type creatures that you know this is what a lot of critters will eat and turn into more critters. And there's also lots that use wetlands perhaps temporarily, or they'll visit them in different ways. You know Coyotes and raccoons will go, visit wetlands to forage and feed and get some water. Damselflies, they'll spend, half their life cycle as aquatic larvae, but they'll hatch out, and some of them, head off into other habitats entirely. So, wetlands get visited by a lot of creatures that don't always live in them year round, but they definitely are critical foraging habitats oftentimes, or at different larval stage, like the cattail caterpillar. The cattail caterpillar needs to chew on some cattails to turn it into a moth later on. So there's all kinds of really interesting little critters. And they also act as really critical refueling stops for birds that head further north. So I mentioned earlier a lot of Arctic nesting geese, but also there's very many shorebirds that will only, alight on the prairie potholes for a very short amount of time. And they really rely on these kind of shallow wetland habitats that are super productive to, refuel. A lot of these flights are incredible marathon flights, and they get these safe spots to just chew up and eat all of those little bits of hyalellas and other chironomids and all kinds of good stuff. So even though some of these birds are only here for a brief amount of time in the spring and fall season, they can be just as critical to the bird's survival and their future reproductive success if they have access to these healthy ecosystems. So they're important refueling stops. Interestingly enough, many of you, if you fished on the prairies, would be familiar with northern pike. These guys actually breed in the shallows of wetlands, and these are places that come summer will often be dried up. But in the springtime, you'll see them kind of moving around and squiggling around, trying to get up into the cattails, and their eggs will scatter and they will attach to different bits of vegetation. And those fish in those kind of shallow areas are safer from all the other big fish that are going to want to eat little baby northern pike. I was actually in an area that had flooded, and then the floodwaters receded, and there was tiny little pike fingerlings in this meadow. It was just the most incredible thing because the water had flown over a road, and when the waters receded, there was still a bit of water on the other side, and the fish couldn't cross the road. So eventually there was some pike left in a meadow, and it was just the strangest thing to see. But they seek out those kind of shallow, weedy habitats. We also get these incredible hatches of midges, and you might have seen these if you've gone camping, spent time near wetlands. The next day it'll just be like, oh, and the side of my house is absolutely covered in these things that kind of vaguely look like mosquitoes, but they're not interested in you. Those are midges. And they're an incredibly important food source, especially for, avian aerial insectivores, so the tree swallows and the purple martins. These guys rely on these hatches of insects for foraging. These guys aren't typical marsh birds, but they do rely on the hatches of insects that occur in the wetland habitats for their food. And now you might not think that these tiny little flies are going to be super important for other things, but these hatches feed an incredible amount of other birds as well. This is a mallard duckling. You can see him scooting forward and actually catching that little midge by the hind legs. Here's a Franklin's gull chasing a midge in midair. You'll often see this in the evenings. Gulls will get up and they'll hawk insects out of the air, and a lot of times it's from these hatches from water and wetland habitat. So you know, it's an important food source for more than just the really aquatic species of birds. Interestingly enough, some of those critters will actually, these are called water boatmen. They're carixids, and they breed in some species will breed in these tiny pothole wetlands, but in the fall, they'll undergo this incredible mass migration and they'll get to deeper waters because, as I mentioned, a lot of those shallow ponds freeze solid straight to the bottom. So these guys are saying, yikes, don't want to deal with that. They actually fly out and spend the winters in river systems or bigger lake systems. And they've actually been shown to be an incredibly important food source for river dwelling fish species over the winter. And I've seen this happen. Like it rains down in the millions on the South Saskatchewan River of these water boatmen. It's just absolutely incredible to watch. The ones that do survive the winter, they migrate and they'll find themselves a pond, they'll find themselves a mate. Well, I mean, maybe they don't pair bond quite that way, but they will reproduce and start the cycle over again. So it's just amazing to me to think, these little wetland bugs in this, pothole could be linked to, fish success in wetland habitats farther or river habitats farther away. I, you know, who would who would have thought, that these linkages would occur, but they do. Unfortunately, we are still losing wetlands here on the prairies and across North America. The estimated loss is 3% of the wetlands per decade in the prairie region, and wetland loss in southern portions of Canada is estimated at 70%. So hopefully through, webinars like this, people start to, maybe value wetlands a little bit more. Maybe you talk to your friends about, hey, these places are actually really cool. Because I do believe conservation starts from people caring and being interested and being passionate and sharing that with other people. If so, go tell people that their wetlands are cool. You would be surprised at how many people, think of it as waste space. So I think they're absolutely fascinating habitats. So if you forgot, we're still in our little kayak journey, and I'm going to wrap up this little wetland portion with a little bit of another soundscape. So this is a different recording from 2 a.m. because if you would believe it, wetlands are also just going nuts at nighttime. And I might be a bit of a strange person, but I love wetlands at night. I don't often do it anymore, but one of my favorite duties while I was out near Foam Lake, Saskatchewan for 4 summers was doing the nocturnal marsh surveys. Just walk out, it would be peaceful. Sometimes there would be northern lights, coyotes howling, and just the incredible stillness and the cacophony of all of these birds going was just incredibly special to me. So, I'm hoping to share a little bit of that to you this evening. So listen to this 2 a.m. wetland recording. Maybe I'll pause it. I forgot to trim that one. So if you had good headphones, You could probably hear that there was just a ton of individuals calling, another five marsh wrens, five sora, a gadwall, blue-winged teal, pied-billed grebe, at least three coots, an American bittern, a yellow-headed blackbird, a common yellowthroat, and a Virginia rail. So a really, incredible soundscape for 2 o'clock in the morning. It is dark. It's just incredible to me that a lot of these birds are still so active at night. Oh, with that, that wraps our first webinar of the series. I thank you for, taking part in this. I can see that we've got 115 people tuned in. That blows me away. This is way more than we had even tuning in at all last year. So thank you so much. If you want to reach out to me, here's my contact information. If you want to take a look at any of those quizzes from last year, or you want to wait, go for it at birdscanada.org/birdscience/marshwatch. You can connect with Birds Canada online on all of the socials as well. And a big thank you to the supporters who, make programming like this possible. The Manitoba Fish and Wildlife Enhancement Fund, the Government of Canada, the Saskatchewan Ministry of Environment's Fish and Wildlife Development Fund, Sask Power, and Wildlife Habitat Canada. So thank you all for tuning in, and I'm going to stop the record button now.